Welcome to the Regulatory Transparency Project's fourth branch podcast series. All expressions of opinion are those of the speaker.
Well, Sam, thank you so much for contributing to our deep dive into the Little Tech agenda.
It's great to be here.
For folks who haven't been following you, can you give us just a brief intro? Why do you care about the Little Tech agenda?
So during the Biden administration, I led the Bureau of Consumer Protection at the Federal Trade Commission. We were kind of the de facto privacy regulator at the FTC. And particularly in 2023, 2024, we started thinking very seriously about how we can use our authorities to protect consumers from AI-related harms, be that fraud or voice cloning, all sorts of problems that were starting to affect consumers. We started using our authorities to try to protect them. Today, I'm at Berkeley Law. I'm a senior fellow there, but I'm no longer in government, but I'm very interested in little tech and AI.
Yeah, and I would love to nerd out with you about being at Berkeley, and I hope you go to Cafe Strata for me.
I have been to Cafe
Go
Strata.
Bears. But we'll leave that for a different, just Berkeley-focused podcast. On little tech and consumer protection, we have a lot to dive into, but let's just start with, how do you define little tech, or what comes to mind for you? Because there's a sort of dictionary definition that I think people could provide for little tech, and then there's sort of a political definition that may come to mind. So of those two, which is most salient for you, or how do you think about it?
So little tech is not a term I use, but I think it's a concept that I think about, and it's an ecosystem where innovators and upstarts can thrive. And one of our big concerns at the FTC, of course, we have Antitrust and Consumer Protection Authority, was that the rise of big tech giants over the last quarter century was shutting out upstarts, was preventing innovation, was holding back innovators. So when I think of a little tech agenda, I think of an economic environment, a legal environment in which upstarts can thrive, and in which big tech needs to always be watching its back because there's always going to be innovators around the corner who could eat their lunch.
Yes. And big tech does love lunch. We know that. So we had Kate Tamarillo of Engine come and provide a perspective from founders of why regulation may not always be in favor of upstarts. And the kind of traditional notion is, hey, if you are a company of 1 to 4 employees, if you are in a garage or a co-working space, there may not be a lawyer around, or if there is one, they want to charge you $400 an hour or $4,000 just to rewrite a privacy policy. So to lean into the sort of regulation may be harmful narrative for just a second, can you give an example of what you think may be misguided regulation that does, in fact, benefit big tech at the expense of little tech? And what does that look like?
I think when you have, and this may be surprising to people, but I think if you have poorly written regulations, they're ambiguous, they have lots of potential loopholes. What you're doing is you're privileging large firms with really good lawyers who can exploit those loopholes over the mom and pop kind of business in the garage that doesn't have a general counsel. So I believe in regulation. I think that's actually essential to little tech and essential to the free enterprise system, and we can get into that. But well-designed regulation should be clear and understandable, and you shouldn't need a whole team of lawyers to interpret it and comply with it.
And I think you probably just received a round of applause from everyone running a startup right now, because the need for that clarity is essential, of planning who can you invest in, what steps you need to take, what staff can you hire, how quickly can you hire them. Figuring all that out is contingent on the regulatory landscape. But that begs a question of, how do you think through a common concern about privacy law in particular, that our current privacy regime is one that's often characterized as a patchwork of 5, 14, seemingly 25, seemingly another couple of states every year adding to this policy quilt and making things anything but clear for startups. So how do you think about this status quo of just a whole hodgepodge of how do people define opt out? What does a right to delete actually mean in Nebraska versus in New Mexico? Tell us, what are your thoughts here?
I mean, the first thing I'll say is I have sympathy for firms that are trying to comply with a bunch of state privacy laws. But I also have a lot of sympathy for state lawmakers who have been waiting year after year after year for the U.S. Congress to pass a comprehensive privacy law. And Congress, year after year after year, fails to do so. And you have states that are dealing with very real-world problems, be it major data security breaches, major health breaches, major data abuses. States are the laboratories of democracy taking action on their own to protect their people. And I think the ironic thing is that, you know, a lot of small tech firms may understandably be frustrated by the patchwork of state laws, but it's often the big tech firms who have been in the lead in fighting federal privacy legislation. So if people are really concerned about patchwork laws, you would expect to see more support for federal baseline privacy protections, but we generally have not seen that support. We've seen opposition to regulation at all levels. So I do have sympathy for firms trying to comply with each state, but at the end of the day, they are trying to protect their citizens from very real harms. And if Congress is concerned about a state-by-state patchwork, Congress can act.
What? Congress can take action. I know it's just not a thing we say all that frequently. And when we're examining the role of Congress in this scenario and the role of big tech, we've talked a little bit about the political economy of big tech versus little tech. How have you seen the level of sophistication of bigger firms, for example, dictate or steer some of these regulatory initiatives? And I want to particularly hear your angle from the FTC and from the perspective of the agencies where we have notice and comment rulemaking, for example. Do we see a lot of startups sending in letters, or to what extent is that process kind of just a way to give big tech a way to voice their own concerns?
Big tech has a big voice in Washington. And one of the things that stood out to me when I was at the FTC is they often don't file comments in their own name. They go through these trade associations. We at the FTC finalized under Chair Khan a very popular rule, click to cancel, to make it as easy to cancel subscriptions as it is to enroll in them. Shortly after we finalized the rule, we got sued over it. You probably would have never heard of the plaintiffs who sued us. They were a bunch of trade associations. But behind those trade associations were some of the biggest tech giants in the world. I won't name them, but everyone knows exactly who they are. And I think that's a lot of the times how big tech operates. They don't want to be seen as opposing popular initiatives like click to cancel, but behind the scenes, they will go through their trade associations, they will go through their network of people, staff throughout regulatory agencies to wield influence over policy in a way that tech startups simply cannot do. So there's no question to me that big tech wields outside influence in Washington, D.C. And I think as citizens, as entrepreneurs, we all should be concerned about that.
And one thing that you'll hear from certain corners of this debate is that, hey, if we actually provide little tech with more regulatory clarity, they might be the ones who can actually develop niche products in a faster fashion that are responding to, let's say, consumer protection harms or privacy concerns of the public more so than big tech. Is that an argument that holds weight for you?
I think that's exactly right. And you can point to historic examples and more recent examples. So one very famous example is for years, AT&T was developing cellular technology, but didn't actually want it deployed because it was going to threaten their landline business. And it took the Department of Justice under the Reagan administration breaking up AT&T in order for cellular technology to thrive and a whole new industry to be born. In more recent years, when I was at the FTC, I mentioned earlier the challenge of voice cloning. The idea that scammers, and voice cloning can have positive uses certainly, but that scammers can harvest your voice essentially and then call your grandma and pretend to be you and scam her out of a lot of money. We put out a challenge. We said we'll pay $25,000, it's not a lot of money, to innovators who can come up with solutions that can help interrupt these scams. And we saw a lot of people come out of the woodwork, people who, don't have big lobbying firms in DC come up with ideas that can actually protect consumers in the marketplace. There might not be a business case for Google or Microsoft or Apple to stop that kind of, to fill that kind of market need, but there are a lot of entrepreneurs who can fill that market need if the government creates the conditions for them to thrive. And I think that's incumbent on government to do.
And it's really interesting to think through the underlying incentives for big tech and little tech for a big tech company, they may have no real skin in the game of, if we have X number of consumer complaints about our product being slightly less than optimal with respect to preventing those types of scams, for example, that's just the cost of doing business. Whereas maybe they calculate and say to actually improve the product would be even more expensive. But as you're pointing out, for a little tech firm, they may have a huge business case to say we can meet that need and we can lean into it. But to your point, it takes the role in some cases of regulators to point out, hey, this is the solution we're hearing from consumers that actually needs to be solved. So if that was such a good use case of the FTC's resources and time, why aren't we seeing more of these sorts of challenges of saying, hey, build it, we want to protect consumers, here's the opportunity?
One of my worries is that we're seeing an attitude in Washington today that any regulation is bad regulation. And I just don't think that's true. I mentioned earlier, and this isn't exactly tech, but subscription cancellation. That was a pro-business regulation because I've talked to many consumers, we heard from many consumers in our rulemaking, they don't feel comfortable purchasing subscription services, which I know a lot of upstarts want to offer because they're worried they're not going to be able to cancel. Many people don't trust AI chatbots because they don't know what the privacy practices are. They don't know what information is going to be shared. Having a legal environment in which people are confident that their data is secure, people are confident they're not going to get ripped off, people are confident that they're not going to have money stolen from them or be subject to major data abuses, is an environment that benefits businesses, as opposed to the current environment where when you don't have trust, when people don't trust that a company on the App Store or a company they haven't heard of is trustworthy, that's ultimately going to benefit big tech because these are the companies that in some ways are too big to care. They, a lot of people have a lot of complaints about some of our largest social media platforms, but those network effects make them very sticky. So we really need an ecosystem where small players who live and die on whether consumers are happy with their products, where small players can thrive and big tech is forced to compete.
So you've painted a good picture of when a regulator perhaps is operating in a great fashion, saying we're going to set out these ground rules, we're going to create this opportunity for little tech to contribute to this important market failure, and is paying attention to how can we write rules in a way with the requisite degree of clarity that makes sure we're not seeing these sort of compliance differentials among big tech versus little tech. Now, if I were to play devil's advocate for a second and say, great, Sam, I love this rosy picture. I can't wait until we have regulators who are clued in to what little tech needs and who are vigorously looking at, is their legislation understandable? Is it legible? Is it something that folks can actually grapple with in the span of 30 minutes instead of 30 hours with the assistance of outside counsel? All of this sounds so great. I don't see when this is going to become the default or the status quo. And so until government proves that it can act like that in a normal fashion, let's just err on the side of less regulation.
Yeah, I think that's a mistake in general. I think certainly if you look at the history of the FTC, we've shown that we have a proven track record of smart regulation, promoting innovation. The eyeglass rule and the contact lens rule, that's the reason you can leave your optometrist with your prescription and go to Warby Parker. There wouldn't be Warby Parker but for those FTC regulations. The FCC is why we have phone number portability. You wouldn't be able to switch carriers easily but for that rule. But I do think that kind of effective regulation, which there is a clear track record of, that does require investing in our public agencies. I think it's hard to hear people, and I'm not directing this at you, on the one hand to say government can't do anything right and doesn't understand our sector. On the other hand, we're gonna starve government. One of the things we did at the FTC under Chair Khan is we brought in a lot of technologists, many of them from the private sector, to help us understand the operation of our rules, the impact of our provisions and consent decrees, help us understand the tech sector so that we could operate to protect consumers without chilling innovation. But you need to give government resources in order for it to be effective. If you starve agencies, if you make sure that they can't bring on good technologists, they can't bring on good lawyers, that's how you're going to get the kind of sloppy regulations. And I will say even worse than that. If you don't have strong anti-corruption protections, you're going to have regulations that are worse than sloppy. There'll be regulations that are written by lobbyists to favor incumbent players at the expense of upstarts. So I really think it's important to invest in state capacity, make sure that regulators have resources and have independence so that they can actually protect the public and not big tech incumbents.
So I'm going to keep pushing buttons because It's just so much fun. So if we think about the importance of that institutional capacity, both the expertise to know what the issues really are, which lends itself to your point, and I totally agree, to the requisite degree of independence. Because if you don't have expertise and independence, well, suddenly that memo from big tech, for example, looks far more compelling. It's so persuasive, and look at all the citations, and I even see a C cite and a CEG. Wow.
It's a list.
This is just nuts. I have to believe whatever they said. If you include 5 cites in a footnote, that's pretty dang good.
Right.
Now I worry about this sort of laboratories of democracy argument, switching gears. And I know you're an FTC man, and I respect that. For, let's say, a state AG's office who doesn't have that requisite degree of expertise or may be struggling to find it, are those going to be flawed experiments of, if our hope is, okay, if we can't get Congress to act and maybe an agency doesn't have the requisite degree of capacity or resources to take something on, is it a wise bet to say, oh, well, let's let states figure it out, even if we're less certain that they have that aspired level of expertise and institutional capacity?
I think it's a fair question, but just to push back against the hypo
so
a
much
little
pushing.
bit.
Whoa, fight the hypo. We don't teach that at Berkeley. Yeah,
that's right. Nobody sat in a room and decided that the best way to regulate privacy was state by state. That was a function of congressional inaction, and that congressional inaction is as much a product of big tech political influence as any other force. The position that states are in is that Congress has not acted, and they are hearing complaints from their citizens who feel they don't trust anything online, they don't trust that their data is going to be secure, they don't trust that their financial information is not going to get stolen, and they're trying to act. I absolutely believe that we need to invest in state capacity, and I do mean the 50 states. Make sure that the same kind of outstanding technologists that worked at the FTC can work at states as well. But you're right. In many states, it's not like big tech focuses its energy on Washington. Big tech operates in every state capital as well, certainly when any privacy legislation is being considered. So I absolutely agree we need to invest in states as well. But I think if you look at this through a broader political economy lens, the reason we're in the situation we are in is because Congress can't get its act together and pass a comprehensive law. And my personal view is that big tech is just fine for that. Big tech has no problem dealing with state-by-state regulations. I think if we actually had a functioning Congress acting in the public interest, we could see strong baseline protections that states could build on, but that create clarity in the marketplace and that reward innovators.
Yeah, and I think there's a lot of folks who would echo the need for that sort of uniformity and agree that in a world of just getting to play God for a second in the sort of regulatory regime we would exist in, yes, having a federal standard would be great. And I wonder, from the perspective of trying to build out that institutional capacity and trying to make sure regulations are working as intended, I'm going to throw yet another bold idea, not a hypo, at you. I am increasingly fascinated by, and this is a podcast for and created by ad law nerds, so we can lean into these topics with relative ease. How can we make retrospective review more robust of saying, hey, we've got this regulation. We're pretty confident it's going to work as intended. Prove it, right? And one of my favorite examples of this is the FTA. I forget when this regulation came on board, so listeners or watchers fill in this picture, said, hey, to protect the interests of the sesame allergy community, we're going to make all foods with sesame include a label saying that there's sesame included here. Companies worried about whether or not they would be compliant with that added more sesame to their food. If it wasn't in there already, they added it just because it was less costly to say, we've included sesame, it's here, don't eat it if you're allergic to sesame, than to make sure you actually didn't have some degree of cross-contamination. Bad law, bad policy, right? Not working as intended. So should we see more investment in retrospective review, in sunset clauses? What's your perspective there?
Well, I think sunset clauses shift an enormous amount of power to people opposing regulations. So I'm not a big fan of that. I am a big fan of retrospective reviews. I'm a big fan of agencies being self-critical and reflective. One of the things we did at the FTC is we did early in Chair Khan's tenure, a retrospective of, I believe it was unreported tech acquisitions. And we looked back at all the acquisitions that fell below the HSR threshold to get a clearer picture of what kind of acquisition tech companies were engaging in. I have done, I won't get into the details because it was non-public, but I have done retrospectives, for example, internally of when we've done warning campaigns to certain industries. I've then had investigators look at, okay, are they complying? Is this working? I think that is really important. I do want to add one thing, though, to what you said in the beginning of your question, which is about federal baseline standards. I completely agree we need a federal comprehensive bill. One thing I will just note, though, is that, because I know it's, people criticize these state laws. I got into consumer protection during the financial crisis and because of the financial crisis. And what you saw in the first decade of this century was the federal government not only ignoring the scourge of subprime lending, but actively trying to stop states from acting. And there was many states in Massachusetts, Illinois, others that were trying to stop subprime lending, and the federal government was actively getting in the way. So I do think even as we weigh sort of uniformity versus state-by-state regulation, we need to also keep in mind that states are closer to problems. States have more visibility into what their citizens are experiencing every day. And that to me is another reason why, especially in an environment where we don't have a federal standard, I'm very sympathetic to states that are trying to protect their citizens, and that's informed by the financial crisis.
And looking at your argument earlier about the benefits of having clear privacy laws for a second, I want to test an argument here with respect to consumer protection now. Saying that, hey, we want to make sure we have good products, we have safe products. What is your response to why not allow the market to dictate what products are safe, what products are aligning with consumer expectations? Because, as noted, we have that odd of those chances of regulation perhaps working in an unintended fashion. For example, with respect to notice and consent privacy laws. Yeah. Yes, I noticed those cookies. Yes, I'm fine with them, right? It hasn't worked in many regards. And so some of the privacy laws, some of the consumer protection laws, again, I know that was an FTA example, so you can just push that to the side. But why not just say, well, the marketplace will allow consumers to say, this product aligns with my consumer protection expectations. This product fell short. I'm going to pay for one and not pay for the other, and the other will go out of business.
Look, I believe in free markets. I believe in their power, but I think they need to be structured in a way that actually produces optimal outcomes. And there's not sort of a single way to do that. And I think if you look at, for example, privacy and data security, this is not an environment where consumers can meaningfully exercise choice and protect themselves. And we've seen this in dozens of FTC cases across Republican and Democratic administrations. Consumers, for all the reasons you reference, don't know. It's one thing when you go to the grocery store and you want to, compare to cookie. You want to compare apples and oranges. Yeah. You can feel them, you can look at them, you can get a sense of whether they're going to meet your needs. If I'm purchasing a digital service, I don't know how they're going to handle my data. I don't really know who they're going to share it with. They might make promises in their terms of service, but I'm not going to read it realistically. I'm not going to understand it if I do. And every one of these companies has taken the position they can change that at will. Data security is even worse. The fact is companies startups especially that invest early in data security are at a competitive disadvantage because they don't realize any advantage in the marketplace by investing in data security. That is not something consumers shop for because it's not something they can shop for. If we had a better structured market, we would incentivize companies to invest in data security and consumers could shop around. So I strongly believe in the power of markets and the best designed regulations harness that power to actually produce outcomes that work. The current landscape is not one that is working either for upstarts or for consumers.
And I'm going to go just slightly outside the bounds of the little tech agenda for a second because I think you're I think you're definitely wicked smart on these issues, and I want to hear what you have to say about this. When I talk to my students about privacy and oftentimes about consumer protection, I know everyone has my data. I know that everyone's surveilling me. I know that some products probably not going to work as intended. That's just the price of doing life in America. How do you combat that notion of, especially among younger generations, there's seemingly a degree of apathy when it comes to privacy, or nihilism even in some cases. So even if you have that regulation, are we sure we're going to see consumers respond to it in a meaningful regard? Or might they just say, no, I would prefer to have that cheaper, more privacy invasive mechanism, whether it's an ad, whether it's an app, you name it. I just want it to be cheaper because my data is already out there.
Yeah, it's a good question. And I don't know if it's nihilism or resignation. I mean, certainly people, you look at sort of Apple App Tracker, when people were able to turn that off, there's evidence that when people actually have choices, they want to have their privacy protected. But for the most part, people do not have choices. And I think many people feel, and they are correct in feeling this. I feel this myself. People ask me all the time, what do you tell consumers about how to protect their data? There's really not much you can do. I mean, yes, use good passwords. Yes, use multi-factor authentication, et cetera, et cetera.
I should show a real estate listing for a cave.
Yeah,
and just
right.
Like, here you go. Yeah, it's
no,
great.
That's right.
Yeah.
But at the end of the day, if some data broker suffers a major breach, I've never even interacted with this data broker. I mean, this is to me another reason why if we had a better functioning market, we were actually able to meaningfully exercise choices that protected our data while still allowing us to access these products and services, I think you would see a very different attitude. But I do think this generation and my generation and generations before us feel a certain resignation, but that is a failure of governance. That is not a failure of sort of consumer education or consumer behavior.
Yeah, and to me, it's fascinating to see how a lot of these issues blur together. Obviously, there's a reason why they're all under the umbrella of the FTC, but from a antitrust perspective now in competition, when you think about bundling, for instance, of, hey, we just have Slack get introduced and everyone thinks, oh, great, Slack's cool. A few months later, Microsoft introduces Teams. And I think applying that forward to, hey, we've got this new great AI startup that perhaps does hold itself out as saying, we're not going to use your data in a certain way. We're not going to sell it to a data broker. But now you name the big tech company, bundles some equivalent competitive tool into their existing offerings. Suddenly consumer just convenience gets you and undercuts that product.
This is why the market, as it's currently structured, is not solving for privacy and is not rewarding companies that actually respect their promises. After ChatGPT came out, and we were monitoring this, we saw a whole slew of companies retroactively change their privacy policies. And I don't mean startups. I mean the biggest companies in the world. retroactively changed their private, and they claim they weren't doing it, they were just clarifying. But what they were saying is, oh yeah, you've been using our email for 20 years and you're completely relying on it. By the way, we're going to train AI in your emails now. But it's going to be really great because we're going to have better autocomplete as well. And I won't name names, but people can guess. I mean, this is the environment we're in. I think this underscores why if we want real innovators to thrive, if we want to meet the need I think people really do have for more privacy protective services, you need to create market conditions that allow those companies to thrive. Those do not exist today.
So let's imagine an alternative universe where sitting across the table from you isn't me, but Mark Andreessen and Ben Horowitz.
Yeah.
They say, Sam, thanks so much for coming in. We want to know, what should we add to the agenda? What are we missing? What would you like to see more heavily prioritized? What are your solutions, or what would you tee up for them?
Well, I would respectfully suggest that they start by reevaluating some of the news they made today. And I know this will be seen later, but just today we saw a White House AI action plan come out. And one of the things the action plan recommends is that the FTC open up a bunch of consent decrees. These are voluntarily agreed upon settlements that are reached with AI companies. Now, I don't know exactly what companies they mean, but if you want market certainty, if you want predictability, if you want clear legal rules, just announcing without any specificity, without any sort of values assigned to it, that settled cases are all going to be reopened, creates huge uncertainty in the market. And I don't just mean uncertainty for the companies that have reached these agreements. The way federal law enforcement works is when the FTC settles, let's say it's a data security settlement with a firm, and says, okay, you need to do the following 3 things to better secure your data. Other companies notice. They implement those same provisions as best practices. So when you suddenly say, we're going to tear it all up, all you are doing is introducing uncertainty into the market. You're punishing those companies that tried to be diligent based on what the federal government was saying a year ago, and you're rewarding those companies that thought they could just wait it out and not take people's data protection or privacy seriously. So I worry a lot. I support, and I know this wasn't exactly your question. I agree with this administration that I want the U.S. to lead on AI. I want a thriving marketplace for innovators to harness the power of AI. But saying that all the laws on the books we're going to sort of discard and we're going to disrupt existing settlements that companies voluntarily agreed to, uncertainty doesn't benefit anyone. But big tech is able to best withstand it.
And I just want to dive into 2 final questions. The first is, oftentimes it seems as though the sort of techlash fervor, as opposed to, let's just say, the techno-optimism unchecked, if we have those 2 kinds of extremes, one aspect of the techno-pessimism, I guess we can label it as, would be, you take examples of, for instance, a crypto transaction going wrong. If you talk to crypto folks, they'll tell you, hey, if you look at the total volume of transactions, the actual percentage of those that are fraudulent is minuscule. And we even had a great example brought up earlier in the series about, you want to know what's a really poor mechanism for avoiding fraud and corruption? Cash, right? So do you see some credibility to the argument that some of these harms, some of these consumer protection harms, are often perhaps dissuading people from using what may ultimately be a more pro-privacy technology? For example, in many cases, you could imagine better uses of blockchain to obscure identities, for example, and to make sure that folks remain anonymous in certain transactions. But if the only headlines are, well, grandma got defrauded again because she bought this meme coin, which doesn't really get to the underlying technology, but instead just gets to that bad actor. Do you think there's something there, or?
I think there's something there, but I think it cuts both ways. There's certainly certain types of harms that maybe the media likes to play up, and it leads consumers to avoid otherwise useful products and services. but you also have a lot of harms that operate in the background that consumers just are not aware of. So, for example, for years, I hope that people know better than this now, but people thought it was incredible that they could download free apps. Wow, it's free. And then it turns out that what these apps were doing was harvesting their sensitive location data and selling to advertisers whether they were going to political protests and where they were worshiping, whether they were buying a gun at a store. I mean, things that should really concern anybody who cares about civil liberties, anyone who cares about privacy. So I certainly think that some harms can be overhyped, but there are a lot of harms that happen behind the scenes that don't really blow up until you have, for example, repression of free expression or a massive data breach by United Health Group that shuts down much of the healthcare system. So I think there's sort of maybe excesses in both directions, but on the whole, I think there's a lot more government can do to limit those harms while still allowing some of the many positive use cases for tech.
And finally, I just have to know, I'm going to have to leave you with yet another hypo. Looking 5 years ahead, what are we saying about the little tech agenda?
I hope that it's thriving. There were early signs that this administration was going to continue, I think, the great work the Biden administration did to challenge big tech monopolies. You had the trial against Meta continue under this administration. We're waiting to see how the 2 cases against Google are going to shake out. I know that there are other cases, too, against Apple and other firms. But you've seen signs in the other direction, too. So I don't know what it's going to look like. My hope, though, is that there's common ground among people who really care about the free market and people who really care about competition in recognizing that if we want innovation, if we want tech to thrive, if we want consumers to thrive, if we want competition to thrive, we can't let big tech maintain a stranglehold on this market. We need to have an ecosystem where little tech can thrive. And if 5 years from now, Microsoft is more worried about competition than a breakup, or Apple is more worried about competition than a breakup, I think we're in a really good place. So that's my hope.
Well, Sam, maybe we'll be talking 5 years from now at Cafe Strata, but for now, we'll let you go on your merry way. Thank you so much for coming on.
Thanks so much. It's great to be here.
On behalf of the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project, thanks for tuning in to the Fourth Branch podcast. To catch every new episode when it's released, you can subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spreaker. For the latest from RTP, please visit our website at regproject.org. That's regproject.org.
This has been a FedSoc audio production.